The times have changed for the world of Teyvat. The old powerhouses are no longer as they used to be. As the young ones cometh, the question remains, is Hu Tao worth pulling for? So, is Hu Tao still a top tier DPS? Surprisingly, or maybe not, yes, she is. Her performance has not really fallen off with the release of newer DPS units, and I would argue that she only got better with the release of both Furina and Shen Yun. Her personality and her playstyle combined captured the heart of many Genshin players with multiple record sales on her banners, granting her a place in multiple collaborations with brands such as OnePlus, Lawson, and the Samsung Galaxy Store. And it is absolutely criminal that these skins are not in the game because oh my god, they look so good. As we've gotten new DPS units, the closest comparison we can do right now is with the 4th Harbinger being Arlecchino. So, how are these two units similar? First of all, both of them are Pyro DPS characters that wield the polearm, and then we have their elemental skill being their main source of infusion in order to activate it. Plus, they both have an elemental burst that can actually heal them individually. If you look at their overall kit, their playstyle is kind of similar to that of a glass cannon, where they are focused on dealing more damage, but they themselves are very fragile and it's very easy for them to die. Both characters can apply a form of Pyro DOT on enemies, where we have Hu Tao with her Blood Blossom and Arlecchino with her Blood Depth Directive from her skill. Now, with all these similarities, how are these two units different? So here's a few key points. Hu Tao's Pyro Infusion is tied to a 9-second duration which goes on a cooldown afterwards, while Arlecchino's Pyro Infusion is tied to a finite resource being the Bond of Life. Now this leads to the next point is that Hu Tao cannot be swapped during the duration of the infusion, otherwise it will be lost. On the other hand, Arlecchino can actually be swapped off anytime as long as she meets the minimum amount of Bond of Life on her to gain the Pyro Infusion. So, Hu Tao's main source of damage mostly comes from her charge attack, a little bit from her burst, while Arlecchino's main source of damage mostly comes from her boosted normal attacks. So, for health states, Hu Tao generally wants to be below 50% HP in order to gain the pyro damage bonus from one of her passive, while Arlecchino, it is in your best interest for her to stay alive. In terms of healing, Hu Tao can be healed by any sources, while Arlecchino cannot be healed outside of her elemental burst and other things like food or the Statue of 7. In terms of stamina usage, Hu Tao will use quite a lot of stamina, so the usage is quite intensive due to her charge attack playstyle, while Arlecchino only needs it for occasional charge attacks or dash cancels. In terms of AoE capability, most of Hu Tao's AoE is tied behind her elemental burst with the ability to pierce multiple enemies in a line with her charge attack. On the other hand, Arlecchino's normal attack does have a decent amount of AoE in terms of the range, and of course we do have her elemental burst. And lastly, Hu Tao's Constellation effect on her mostly stops at C1 because anywhere beyond that doesn't really change the way you play her, and unless you go all the way to C6, even C6 Hu Tao is not really going to change anything too much for her damage, you just change the way you build your artifacts. On the other hand, Arlecchino's low Constellations are absolutely great, and her Constellation 6 is pretty much insane. So let's go over Hu Tao's both pros and cons, starting with the pros. So Hu Tao has relatively high single target damage with her charge attack, and since her elemental skill converts her max HP into attack, she is less reliant on attack buffing units such as Bennett or Sarah. Her ability to heal removes the need for running a healer in your team, which in turn opens up a slot for another sub DPS or a support for her. Since her ADC build usually runs a HP percent sans, you would usually get a Hu Tao with an average of 28k to 30k HP. This will make her relatively tanky compared to other regular attack scaling DPS. Hu Tao is also very rewarding for any skill-based players who want a little bit of a challenge, since mastering her will require practice over her best combos, which will include animation cancels. Now, what are her cons? She has very limited AoE outside of her burst. She also does require some amount of mechanical skill, as maxing out her overall damage does require animation cancels, specifically jump cancel for C0. To quickly explain what this is, it is possible to use the jumping animation in order to cancel her charge attack animation. This will allow you to weave in more charge attacks than usual, which leads you to an overall damage increase. Of course, since her playstyle is centered around spamming charge attack and it does consume quite a lot of stamina, she will have a bit of stamina issues at Constellation 0 until you get C1. Lastly, her best team is quite reliant on these two units being Yelan or Xingqiu. this may not be a good thing, especially if you only have one of them in your account, or they are currently running in another team that needs them, such as another vape team for another pyro DPS or the likes of Hyperbloom. So for gearing, Hu Tao is relatively F2P friendly. Most of her weapons and artifacts are quite accessible. For weapons, we do have the gacha 4-star standard weapon, which everyone would have R5 by now, being the Dragon Spade. If you have a bit of cash to spare, both Battle Pass weapons being the Deathmatch and the Ballad of the Fjords are pretty good options on her, especially at high refinements. In fact, Ballad of the Fjords at Refinement 5 can actually compete and is only second best behind the Staff of Homa, making it the best 4-star weapon for Hu Tao before you get any 5 stars. Of course, we do have the Lithic Spear if you were to run her in a leeway only team like a double Hydra with Zhongli. And otherwise, we do have the event weapons being Missive Wind Spear at Refinement 5 is also a decent option. If you want to look for a budget option or your account is still relatively new, the 3-star White Tassel at Refinement 5 is also a pretty good option. For artifacts, we have the likes of Crimson Witch, Shimenawa, Gilded Dreams, and of course Mixed 2-piece. All of their performances is very reliant on your substats, and Crimson Witch and Shimenawa are roughly equal to each other, but Crimson Witch is a bit better if you do want to use burst in your rotation. But otherwise, if you want to spam charge attack, Shimenawa is quite better by a certain amount. I can speak for this because I ran Shimenawa Hu Tao for quite a while, and the damage is quite good. You can easily see over 100k charge attack with enough investment. Gilded Dreams is good if your Hu Tao does not have any other sources of elemental mastery, because once you get too much to a certain point, the EM from Gilded Dreams is not really going to give that much of an advantage over the other 2 pieces. For main stats, you want to run HP Sands, Pyro Damage Goblet, and Crit Circlet based on whichever you need. Now, let's take a look at her constellations. So, Constellation 1 is her best constellation, offering good quality of life by making her infused charge attacks consume no stamina. Not only does this feel very good to play, it is especially rewarding for any skilled players, since now you can use dash cancels instead of jump cancels. On paper, this will allow you to fit in 2 more charge attacks, which is, well, more damage. It's pretty good. And for reference, a Constellation 0 Hu Tao using jump cancels can only fit about 8 charge attacks, while Constellation 1 Hu Tao using dash cancels can do up to 10. In the right hands, this Constellation will grant you about a 20% damage increase compared to C0. And numbers aside, my favorite part about this Constellation is how you can use it to close the distance between you and your enemies, which is pretty nice in the Abyss. So even if you have no stamina at all, you can use her charge attack as long as your weapon is still infused in order to travel where you need to, and I think that's pretty cool. So Constellation 2 increases the Blood Blossom damage, and it makes it so that your bursts apply Blood Blossom on any enemies hit by it. It does add a bit of damage, but it's not necessary because usually you're not going to be using your burst as much, and preferably you would like to stay below 50% HP, and healing is not really what you want to do. This Constellation is about a 7% damage increase from Constellation 1. C3 adds 3 levels for her elemental skill, which roughly leads to a 9% damage increase from C2. Constellation 4 gives crit rate to allies after defeating enemies with the Blood Blossom effect. Similar to her Ascension 1 passive, but it's not really useful for single target fights, especially against bosses. Constellation 5 adds 3 levels for the burst. It is a very minor damage increase unless you play a nuke level of Hu Tao. And of course, we do have Constellation 6, which triggers whenever Hu Tao is either below 25% max HP or she takes lethal damage. So first of all, she doesn't die whenever this happens, and her elemental and physical res will be increased by 200%, plus she will gain 100 crit rate. This Constellation is on a 1-minute cooldown, and it's usually made for any sort of nuking or singular flow setups. I'm sure any one of you have probably seen all those nuke videos all over YouTube with the 2 million or 3 million melt Hu Tao damage burst build. So this Constellation allows you to build around very low crit rate, focusing your artifact builds more towards high crit damage, so it is quite easy for you to see any C6 Hu Tao owners with over like 300 crit damage. The damage increase versus C5 is as such. Now, let's move on to Hu Tao teams. So before we go to the next section, here are the different abbreviations that I will be using in the next section, so feel free to pause the video just to take a look. So all these teams were simulated over on GC Sim, assuming 210 crit value for every single character, and they are only using F2P weapons. This means no Battle Pass weapons and no 5-star, and also all the 4-star units are considered to be Constellation 6, while all the 5 stars are at Constellation 0. So for the first team, we do have the VV Vape setup, specifically the variant with Xingqiu. And as you can see, it gives you quite a modest amount of 55.7k DPS over the sim duration of 82 seconds. Of course, Hu Tao is the one doing most of the damage, and this setup is pretty standard for VV Vape. I think the performance is quite decent, but I honestly expected this to be a bit better, and this is why we will get to the next team. Of course, the same team again, VV Vape, but the only difference is that we replace Xingqiu with Yelan, which makes setting up double swirls much easier. As you can see here, the overall DPS or the average DPS over 75 seconds is about 75,000 DPS, and this is also with 210 CV Yelan, so I was actually quite surprised to see that this performance is quite comparable to some of the really good teams out there. And of course, if you want to run them both, the Hu Tao Double Hydra Vape team is also pretty good, especially because this is the one team that can actually run the Lithic Spear, which is especially good if you do have high refinement, because the entire team is comprised of purely leeway units. This team boasts a total DPS of 63,000 over a sim time of slightly over a minute, and both Xingqiu and Yelan is actually holding up quite well on their own, granted that their total damage contribution is about equal or if not better than Hu Tao. This is probably the most casual version of all the Hu Tao teams because it doesn't require you to do any sort of complex double swirl setups. All you have to do is just use Zhongli Shield, press a bunch of buttons, and just make sure you play Hu Tao, and you're gonna do enough damage to clear most of the content that the game has to offer. We can move on to the Double Geo Vape teams, which may or may not be consistent. So the first variant I try to look at that one of my friends used to run is the Hu Tao Double Geo team with Albedo, and the team DPS is 48,000, 49,000. It is quite decent, and I think it's kind of more consistent and more average. Albedo and Xingqiu does do a good portion of the team's damage, but in terms of the overall DPS, it is kind of expected because I think Albedo is going to steal a little bit of the Hydro Aura, so some of Hu Tao's hits is unable to vape. And of course, we can look at the other variation, which is replacing Albedo with Chiori. This team is definitely better by quite a bit. You can see a 7,000 increase in average DPS, totaling up to about 55.8k. And Chiori and Xingqiu are both carrying their own weight with a pretty equal damage distribution. And of course, just out of curiosity, I tried to simulate the Mono Pyro team, and the numbers are somehow even worse than the Double Geo Vape team, only at 45,000. While this team is mostly just something I considered for the sake of the memes. If you do want to run this, go ahead, but just keep in mind that there are much better options out there. And then out of curiosity, I remember that we did have Chevreau, so I tried to simulate an overloaded hyper carry Hu Tao team with Chevreau, Fischl, and Bennett, and surprisingly the damage is actually quite comparable to the VV Vape for the Yelan variant, resulting at 73,000 average DPS over a sim time of 83 seconds. Everyone is contributing a good amount of damage, well, maybe not Bennett, but Fischl with the overloaded, and of course added up with Hu Tao, they are adding quite a good amount of damage. Of course, the Chevreau is built a little bit more towards DPS because it is at Constellation 6, and I believe one of her Constellations does add like 2 skills, and I think the rotation does include using her 2 skills, so her damage is not completely negligible, and it does add like quite a bit for the team, but I was quite surprised. So in the right situations, I think I would probably have to record this, and I'm very excited to try this out from my own account. Maybe one day I'll get Constellation 6. And of course, her most premium team that I simulated, which does require quite a bit of 5 stars, is the Hu Tao Vape Plunge team with Furina and Shen Yun. As I mentioned earlier, with the release of these 2 units, the performance of this team, even on the most casual level, is quite comparable to, I believe, the overloaded hypercarry Hu Tao team, resulting in a 76k average DPS. Hu Tao is doing most of the damage with being able to fit like 6 plunge attacks aside with 6 charge attacks. Honestly, the team's performance is just quite surprising to me. So like I think overall, like with all these numbers, Hu Tao's team is still very much as good as it was back then, and I would say it definitely has gotten much better. Now that I think about it, Shilonen is going to be released literally like less than a week by the time this video comes out, so I would be curious to try that when it's out. So to close things off, Hu Tao is still very much a top contender as one of the best DPS in the current lineup of Genshin Impact. Her worth has still remained unchanged till this day, and I think honestly, polling for her is really just a matter of personal preference because her spot in the meta is still very much solid even until today. Of course, that is when you consider with characters like Furina, Yelan, and Shen Yun, but these are very likely units that I think most people would be very much interested in and would probably have in their account. So yeah, let me know what you guys think about Hu Tao in the comment. Are you going to be pulling for Hu Tao or Nahida, or are you guys going to be skipping for 5.2, or maybe you're pulling for either Shilonen and for some reason Chiori? Otherwise, that is it for now. This is Ethereal, signing off. Peace!